My name is Claire Whitmore, and I am 31 years old. And 3 years ago, my husband stopped believing in God, right around the same week we buried his mother. 2 Sundays ago, I watched that same man walk to the front of our church during the invitation, stand at the altar rail with his shoulders shaking, and pray out loud for the first time in 3 years, in front of nearly 200 people, most of whom had quietly written him off a long time before I ever gave up on him myself. I want to tell you about the 3 years in between, because I know some of you are living inside your own version of them right now, praying for someone who has gone quiet on God and on you, with absolutely no evidence that it will ever turn around. I do not have a formula for you, I only have what actually happened, and I think that is worth more anyway. There is a particular kind of exhaustion that comes from being the only person in a room who still believes something is going to change, and I want you to know, before I tell you anything else, that I felt every bit of that exhaustion across those 3 years, more times than I can count, and I am not going to pretend otherwise just because I already know how this story ends. I think the honest middle of a story like this one is worth just as much as its ending, maybe more, because most of us are living somewhere in the middle of our own right now, without the comfort of already knowing how it turns out. If you have ever been told by people who love you that you should give up on someone, and you did not, this one is for you. Go ahead and subscribe, and tell me in the comments where you are listening from, because I read every single one, and more than a few of you already know exactly what this story is going to cost me to tell. Let me take you back to Millbrook, Ohio, a little suburb about 25 minutes north of Columbus, and to the woman who started all of this without ever once meaning to. Joyce Whitmore was Ryan's mother, and I want to tell you about her before I tell you about anything that happened after she was gone, because you cannot understand what broke in my husband without first understanding what he lost. Joyce taught second grade for 31 years at the elementary school 2 streets over from the house she and Frank raised Ryan in, and she ran the children's choir at Grace Fellowship for almost as long, a small non-denominational church with a gravel parking lot and a sign out front that still had a few of the original hand-painted letters from the year it was built. She had a laugh you could hear from the parking lot, and she called everyone honey regardless of how well she actually knew them, and she prayed over Ryan every single night of his childhood, standing in his doorway with the hallway light behind her, a habit she never once broke even after he was grown and married and living 2 towns over. I met her myself for the first time about 3 months into dating Ryan, at a spring cookout in the Whitmore's backyard, and what I remember most is how she asked me questions like she actually planned to remember the answers, which sounds like a small thing until you have spent enough of your life around people who ask questions purely to fill a silence. She asked about my own mother, about my teaching certification, about a stray dog I had mentioned once, weeks earlier, in passing, to Ryan, and somehow that dog had made its way all the way to Joyce, and she asked after him by name. I met Ryan at a friend's barbecue the summer after I finished my teaching certification, and within about 20 minutes of watching him help an elderly neighbor carry folding chairs to her car without being asked, I understood I was in real trouble. We dated a year and a half, married at Grace Fellowship on a Saturday in October, and Joyce cried through the entire ceremony, the good kind of crying, and hugged me afterwards so hard I nearly lost my footing, and told me, right there in the receiving line, that she had been praying for me since Ryan was in middle school, long before either of us knew each other existed. I want you to hold on to that detail, because it matters later. Joyce Whitmore prayed for me by name for over a decade before I ever met her son. I have thought many times since about the strange, quiet arithmetic of that. A woman spending years praying for a daughter-in-law she had never met, and her own son, years after she was gone, becoming the one I had to learn to pray for in exactly the same patient, unrewarded way. Ryan worked alongside his father Frank at the auto shop Frank had run for nearly 30 years on the edge of town, a low brick building with a gravel lot and a bell over the door that still worked, and most Sundays after church the four of us, Ryan, me, Frank, and Joyce, ate dinner together at Joyce's table, pot roast most weeks, her own mother's recipe, and I remember those Sundays now the way you remember a season of weather you did not appreciate enough while it was happening. Joyce found the lump herself, in the shower, on an ordinary Tuesday in March, 3 years ago now. She told Frank that night, and Frank drove her to the doctor the following morning, and within 2 weeks the word pancreatic had entered our family's vocabulary and never really left it. I do not want to walk you through every appointment, because there were dozens, and grief like that does not need every detail to land its full weight. What I will tell you is that it moved fast, faster than any of the doctors expected, 7 months from diagnosis to the funeral home, and that Ryan spent nearly every one of those 7 months at his mother's bedside, whenever the shop could spare him, holding her hand, reading to her from whatever book she asked for, singing the hymns she had taught the children's choir for 3 decades in a voice that had never once, in all our years together, sounded steady before that spring. There was a stretch in the middle of those 7 months, before the worst of it, where Joyce still had good days, and on those days Ryan would bring her out to the shop parking lot in a wheelchair Frank had borrowed from the pharmacy, and the three of them, Ryan, Frank, and Joyce, would sit out there in the sun for an hour, while Ryan worked on whatever car happened to be up on the lift, Joyce narrating his own childhood back to him the whole time. This is the same boy who used to hand his father wrenches before he could reach the pedals, and Ryan would laugh, and for that hour, I think, none of us let ourselves believe what the calendar was actually telling us. I sat with her myself most Thursday afternoons, my one day off that semester, and we talked about everything except the thing that was actually happening, mostly. Her garden, her second graders from decades back who still sent her Christmas cards, a recipe for the pot roast she wanted to make sure I had written down correctly before it was too late for her to correct me. She never once, in all those Thursdays, said a single word of complaint about what was happening to her body. She said once, near the end of one of those afternoons, almost as an aside, that she had made peace with wherever this was heading a long time before any of the rest of us had, and that the only thing that still worried her at night was Ryan, not herself. There is one evening from those 7 months I need to tell you about specifically, because it is the hinge this entire story turns on, and I did not understand its full weight until much later. It was near the end, in the hospital, a week or so before Joyce passed, and a longtime deacon from Grace Fellowship, named Walter Combs, came by to sit with the family and pray. Walter is a kind, sincere man, in his 70s, who has walked more families through more hospital rooms than almost anyone at that church, and I do not believe for 1 second that he meant anything but comfort when he took Ryan's hand that night and said, "Son, I know this is hard, but remember, even this is under God's hand, even the sickness." The same book of Exodus where God tells Moses at the burning bush that he is the one who makes a person able to see or blind, able to hear or deaf, that is the same God who is holding your mother right now, and nothing touches her outside of what he allows. Walter meant that as the deepest comfort he knew how to offer, a reminder that nothing was random, that God had not looked away. Ryan heard something else entirely. He heard, sitting in a plastic chair beside his dying mother's bed, that the God he had loved his whole life had personally, deliberately, handed his mother a disease that was eating her alive from the inside, on purpose, the same way that verse said God had once decided who would be born blind or deaf. He did not say anything to Walter that night. He thanked him, the way you thank someone in a hospital room regardless of what they have actually said to you, and Walter left believing he had helped. I was in the room for that whole exchange, sitting on the far side of the bed, and I want to be honest that I did not think anything of it in the moment either. It sounded to me like the kind of thing people say in hospital rooms all the time, meant to steady rather than to wound, and I had heard some version of it more than once over the years without it ever once catching in me the way it apparently caught in him. Ryan did not tell me what that sentence had done to him until nearly 2 years later, and by then it had already grown roots deep enough to choke almost everything else in him. Joyce died 6 days after that conversation, on a Thursday morning in October, almost exactly 1 year to the week after our own wedding at that same church, with Frank on one side of the bed and Ryan on the other, and I was in the hallway when it happened, having stepped out to let the two of them have that last hour alone, and I will never stop being grateful that I gave them that, even though it means I was not in the room myself. The funeral was enormous, standing room only at Grace Fellowship, 3 decades of second graders and choir children grown into adults filling the pews, and Ryan stood at the front and read a short, plain tribute about his mother's laugh, and did not cry once, and I remember thinking, at the time, how strong he was being, and understanding only much later that what I had actually watched was a man closing a door. I remember specifically the moment after the service, in the receiving line, when an old woman I did not recognize, one of Joyce's former students, gray-haired herself by then, took Ryan's hand and told him that his mother had once stayed after school for an entire month, every single day, to help her learn to read, and that she had never forgotten it 40 years later, and Ryan thanked her, politely, the same flat, careful politeness he would carry for the next 3 years, and I watched something in his face that I did not have a name for yet. He did not cry for weeks after that, not once, not in front of me, not that I ever heard through a closed bathroom door, nothing. He went back to work at the shop within 10 days, threw himself into it the way some men do, and stopped, without any announcement at all, coming to church. I asked him about it the first Sunday he did not get dressed. Gently, standing in our bedroom doorway the way, it occurred to me only recently, Joyce used to stand in his, and he said, "I just need a week," and I gave him the week, and then the week after that, and somewhere in there I understood I had stopped counting weeks and started counting something else instead. He stopped praying before meals, a habit he had kept every single day since I had known him. He stopped reading the small worn Bible Joyce had given him for his 16th birthday, the one that sat on his nightstand collecting dust for the better part of 3 years, closed. When Pastor Mark Ellison called to check on him about a month in, Ryan took the call standing in the garage with his back to me, and I heard enough of it to understand that whatever the pastor said, Ryan's only real answer was a long silence and then, "I don't know what I believe right now, Mark, and I'm not ready to pretend otherwise for anybody's comfort but my own." I want to tell you honestly that I did not fully understand, in those early months, what was actually happening inside him. I thought it was simple grief, the kind that eventually lifts with time, and I kept waiting for the lifting, the way you wait for a fever to break. It took me the better part of a year to understand that Ryan was not simply grieving. He was furious, at God specifically, in a way he did not yet have words for, and the fury had a shape, and the shape had come from one sentence, spoken beside a hospital bed, that none of us but Ryan even remembered had been said. It was around the 6-month mark that the advice started arriving in earnest, and I want to walk you through it honestly, because I think this is the part of the story most people never hear. My own mother, Carla, sat me down at her kitchen table on a Sunday afternoon, the same table I had done my homework on as a girl, and told me plainly that she loved Ryan, that she always had, but that she was watching her daughter live with a man who had checked out of half of who he used to be, and that she did not think I should have to spend the next 40 years married to a stranger wearing my husband's face. She was not cruel about it. She was scared for me, and I understood that even while it broke something in me to hear her say it out loud. My closest friend Danielle, who had stood up in our wedding and had watched Ryan and me from the very beginning, told me over coffee that a marriage needs 2 people pulling the same direction, that faith had been the whole foundation of what drew me to him in the first place, and that she did not know how I planned to build a life and eventually raise children with a man who had walked away from the one thing we had always shared. She said it gently, but she said it more than once, over the following months, each time a little more directly, until the last time she said it, she used the actual word divorce, sitting across from me in a booth at the Cracker Barrel off the highway, her hand resting on mine like she was delivering hard medicine rather than an opinion. Even people at Grace Fellowship, kind people, people who loved Joyce and had known Ryan since he was small, found their own ways of saying some version of the same thing. A woman from the women's ministry told me, not unkindly, that the Lord did not intend for me to carry a spiritually dead marriage forever, and that sometimes love means releasing someone to find his own way back on his own time, away from the pressure of a wife watching him fail too. I did not know, at the time, whether releasing him and leaving him were the same thing in her mind, and I never worked up the nerve to ask. There was one more voice that stung longer than any of the others, oddly enough because it came in the gentlest possible form. My own sister Emily, who lives 3 states away and only heard about most of this secondhand through our mother, sent me a long, careful text message about 8 months in, the kind clearly composed and revised before it was ever sent, telling me she had been praying about how to say this, and that she believed with her whole heart that God sometimes closes a door, not to punish us, but to make room for something better He already has waiting, and that perhaps this whole ordeal was God's way of showing me it was time to move on. I read that text sitting in my classroom during a planning period, and I remember setting my phone face down on the desk and staring at a bulletin board covered in construction paper leaves for a long time before I could bring myself to type anything back at all. A coworker of mine, a fellow second-grade teacher named Dawn, who did not know Ryan at all, beyond a few holiday parties, offered her own version of the same advice one afternoon in the teacher's lounge, entirely unprompted, after I had mentioned, in passing, that I was tired. She told me, kindly enough, that she had gone through something similar with her own first husband years before, though for different reasons, and that the hardest lesson she had ever learned was that you cannot love someone into wanting to be loved, that eventually you simply have to accept the person in front of you is not the person you married, and let yourself grieve that loss on its own terms. I did not argue with her, because I did not have the energy to explain that I did not believe, even on my hardest days, that Ryan had actually stopped being the person I married, only that he was temporarily buried under something too heavy to carry and still recognize himself underneath. I simply thanked her for her honesty and finished my coffee and went back to my classroom, and I remember thinking, walking down that hallway, that I had now heard some version of the same advice from nearly every person in my life who loved me, and that the sheer volume of agreement among them had started to feel, some days, like its own kind of evidence against me. I want to be honest that there was a period, somewhere in that second year, where the weight of all those voices nearly won. I remember one particular night sitting in our closed garage in my car after work, engine off, not driving anywhere, simply sitting there, because it was the only room in my life nobody was giving me advice in, and I cried harder that night than I had at Joyce's funeral, because I did not know anymore whether I was being faithful or simply stubborn, and nobody around me seemed to think there was a difference. It was an old widow from our church, a woman named Ruth Talbot, well into her 80s, who kept me from making a decision that night that I believe I would have regretted for the rest of my life. I had gone to her, almost by accident, the following week, mostly because she had lost her own husband decades before, and I did not know who else to talk to, who was not already lobbying me toward an answer. Ruth lived alone in a small house not far from the church, and she made me tea I did not really want, and sat across from me in a chair that had clearly been her husband's, worn soft in the shape of a man who had been gone for over 20 years, and she listened to the whole thing, all of it. Carla, Danielle, the woman from the women's ministry, all of it, without interrupting once. When I finally finished, she was quiet for a long moment, turning her own cup in her hands, and then she asked me a question I had not expected. She asked whether I had ever once, in the whole 3 years, actually asked Ryan what he wanted me to do, rather than asking everyone else what they thought I should do about him. I admitted I had not directly, not in those exact words, and she nodded like she had already guessed as much. She told me that in her experience, most marriages that survive genuinely hard seasons are not saved by one spouse's certainty, but by both spouses eventually being honest with each other about how uncertain they actually feel, and that perhaps the bravest thing I could do was not decide anything permanent at all, but simply ask my own husband, plainly, whether he wanted me still there, and let his answer, not everyone else's fear, be the thing I actually listened to. Then she said the sentence I have carried with me every day since. She said, "Claire, honey, everybody advising you to leave is picturing the marriage you have right now going on forever, exactly as it is. Nobody advising you to stay is promising you it won't. The question was never whether staying guarantees anything. The question is only whether you still believe God is able to do something you cannot yet see, and that is not a question anybody else gets to answer for you." I did ask Ryan that same week, sitting on our back porch after Grace had gone to sleep, whether he wanted me to stay, plainly, without dressing the question up in anything softer. He was quiet for a long moment, and then he said, more honestly than he had said almost anything to me in over a year, that he did not know how to want anything clearly right now, about God or about us or about most things, but that the thought of coming home to an empty house scared him more than almost anything else he could imagine, and that if I was asking whether some small part of him was still fighting for this, underneath everything else, the answer was yes, even if he could not always prove it to me the way I deserved. I did not leave that conversation with certainty either. I left it with something smaller and, it turned out, sturdier than certainty, which was simply a decision to keep going one more week, and then, when that week ended, to make the same decision again. Here is what those 3 years actually looked like from the inside. And I want to tell you honestly, because I do not think it is fair to the people living through their own version of this right now to make it sound tidier than it was. I prayed for Ryan by name every single night, sometimes out loud, more often silently beside him in bed while he slept. Not eloquent prayers, mostly just his name and the word please, repeated in 100 different shapes over 3 years. I kept going to church without him, alone, sitting in the same pew we used to share, and more than a few Sundays I cried through the entire service and told nobody why. I did not nag him about church, did not leave devotionals on his pillow, did not quote scripture at him in the middle of an argument, because somewhere early on I understood that would only give his anger something solid to push against, and I did not want to be the wall he was fighting. I simply kept being his wife, made his coffee the way he liked it, listened when he wanted to talk about the shop, or about his father, or about anything at all except God, and stayed quiet, without resentment, on the days he did not want to talk about anything. There was a particular rhythm to those years that I only recognized once it was over. Ryan worked longer hours at the shop than he ever had before Joyce died, as though the work itself had become a kind of substitute prayer, something with an answer he could actually see at the end of each day, a car fixed, a bill paid, a problem solved with his own 2 hands instead of handed up to a God he had stopped trusting to solve anything at all. I understood that, eventually, even while it meant more evenings alone than I had ever expected to spend in my own marriage. I filled some of those evenings with Grace, once she came, and some of them with a stack of library books, and some of them simply sitting on our back porch watching the same sunset I had once watched with him, learning slowly how to be lonely inside a marriage without letting the loneliness curdle into bitterness, which I will tell you honestly did not happen automatically, and took real, daily, unglamorous effort most days. I will tell you it was not always graceful. There was a night in the 2nd year, after a particularly hard visit to the cemetery on what would have been Joyce's birthday, where Ryan said something sharp and unfair to me, something about how at least I still had a mother who could give me advice. And I said something back I am not proud of, about how at least his mother had not spent 3 years slowly disappearing from her own marriage, and we did not speak for most of a weekend after that, and I remember lying awake that Saturday night wondering if Danielle had been right after all. I want you to know that moment happened, because I think it matters that this was never a smooth, saintly 3 years. It was 2 hurting people, most days simply managing not to make it worse. Our daughter Grace was born the following spring, right in the middle of the hardest stretch, and I want to tell you that Ryan was a good father from her very first day, gentle and present in every ordinary way a father is supposed to be, even while the largest room in his own heart stayed locked. He rocked her at 2 in the morning without complaint. He built her a little wooden rocking horse in the shop on his own time. He simply never once, in those early years, prayed over her the way I had watched Joyce pray over him in old home videos, and I think that absence, more than almost anything else, was the one that quietly broke my heart the most. Frank, Ryan's father, never once told me to leave, and never once pushed his son either. He kept coming to church every single Sunday after Joyce died, sat in their old pew alone, and told me once, over pie at the diner in town, that he understood exactly what his son was carrying, because some nights he carried a version of it himself, and that the only thing he knew to do about it was keep showing up to the same pew until it either helped or it didn't, and that he figured Ryan would find his own way there eventually, in his own time, the same way grief always eventually finds its own slow way through a person. I asked Frank once, near the end of that second year, whether he had ever been angry at God himself, the way his son so plainly was, and he thought about it for a long moment before answering, stirring his coffee though he had already finished putting sugar in it. He said he supposed he had, in his own quieter way, mostly at 3 in the morning when the house was too empty and too quiet, but that he had decided early on that being angry at God and walking away from God were two different choices, and that he intended to keep making the second choice even on the nights the first one felt more honest. He said, "I figure the Lord can handle my anger a good deal better than he could handle my absence, and I have thought about that sentence often in the years since, because I believe it is the quiet hinge this whole story actually turned on, long before Ryan ever had his dream." Frank never stopped showing up, not once, in 3 years, and I have come to believe that his own steady, unglamorous faithfulness in that same pew, week after week, without ever once forcing his son toward it, did more to keep the door open for Ryan than any conversation either of us ever had with him directly. There is one more conversation from that stretch of years I have never told anyone outside of Pastor Mark himself, and I want to include it now because I do not want this story to sound like I never once doubted anything myself. About a year and a half in, on a particularly hard week, I made an appointment to see Mark alone, without telling Ryan, and sat across from him in his small church office, with its stacks of commentaries and a framed photograph of his own family on the desk, and I told him plainly that I did not know anymore whether I actually believed God was going to do anything at all, or whether I had simply built my whole identity around being the wife who never gave up, which felt, some days, like its own kind of trap rather than any kind of faith. Mark did not correct me, and he did not quote me a verse, which I was grateful for, because I do not think I could have received one gracefully that particular week. He asked me instead what I thought I would regret more in 20 years, staying faithful to a decision that never paid off, or leaving and never knowing whether it would have. I told him I did not know. He said that not knowing was, in his experience, usually the actual shape faith took most of the time, not the certainty people talked about from pulpits, but a willingness to keep walking in the dark, without demanding to see the next several steps before taking the first one. He prayed with me before I left, a short, plain prayer, nothing dramatic, and told me he would keep praying for both Ryan and me privately, without ever mentioning it to Ryan directly unless I wanted him to. I told him I did not yet, and he respected that for the entire remaining year and a half, never once bringing it up with my husband, which I have come to understand was its own quiet, costly kindness. The dream came on a Tuesday night in the fall, almost exactly 3 years after Joyce's diagnosis. I woke up sometime after 2 in the morning to find Ryan sitting up in bed beside me, not moving, staring at the wall, and when I asked what was wrong, he did not answer for a long moment, and then he turned to me with tears already running down his face, more openly than I had seen him cry in the entire 3 years since his mother died, and said, "I saw her, Claire. I saw my mom." He told me the dream in pieces, stopping more than once to catch his breath, and I am going to tell it to you now, the way he told it to me. He said he was standing in a field he did not recognize, green in a way no field in Ohio is ever quite that green, and his mother was there, younger than she had been at the end, her hair the way it looked in photographs from before he was even born, laughing the same laugh he used to be able to hear from the parking lot at Grace Fellowship. She was not sick. She was not tired. She was simply, entirely herself, more herself than he had seen her in years, moving through that field like someone who had finally set down something heavy she had been carrying her whole life without either of them ever quite noticing the weight of it. He said there was a particular detail that undid him more than any other part of it, a small thing, almost embarrassing to say out loud, he told me, but he noticed she was not wearing the reading glasses she had worn every day of her adult life, the ones she was always misplacing, the ones he used to find for her under couch cushions and in the pockets of coats she had not worn in months. In the dream her eyes were simply clear, unclouded, looking straight at him without needing anything between them, and he said something about that detail, more than anything grand or symbolic, made the whole thing feel real to him in a way he could not fully explain, the way a small true fact convinces you of a larger one you had been unable to believe on faith alone. She did not say much to him, he told me. She mostly just laughed and reached out and touched his face the way she used to when he was small, and said one sentence he has repeated to me so many times since that I could recite it myself now without missing a word. She said, "Honey, I am so happy here. You would not believe how happy I am." He woke up crying, he told me, not from sadness, from something closer to relief, a physical unclenching he said he could feel in his chest, in his jaw, in his hands, a tightness he realized, only in the moment it finally let go, had been sitting in his body every single day for 3 years. He told me, sitting there in the dark, that he had spent 3 years unable to get past one sentence a well-meaning old man had said beside his mother's hospital bed, a sentence about God being the one who makes a person blind or deaf, and by his own logic at the time, therefore the one who had made his mother sick, on purpose, the way you might deliberately break something you did not want anymore. He said he had built 3 years of silence on top of that single idea, that a God who could do that to a woman who had spent her entire life teaching second graders to love him was not a God he had any interest in kneeling in front of again. He told me, too, that he had gone looking, quietly, more than once over those 3 years, for someone who could argue him out of that conclusion, and had never once found an argument that actually reached the place the hurt was actually living. He said arguments had always stayed in his head, careful and reasonable, and entirely beside the point, while the hurt itself lived somewhere lower down, in his chest, in the space just under his ribs, a place no sentence, however true, had ever once managed to touch until that field, until his mother's hand on his face, until a single ordinary sentence, spoken by someone who was not trying to win anything from him at all. He said the dream had not answered the theological question at all. Not really. Not in the way an argument would have. Nothing about pancreatic cancer suddenly made logical sense to him at 2 a.m. What had changed, he said, was smaller and larger at the same time. He had spent 3 years so focused on why God might have allowed his mother to suffer, that he had never once let himself actually picture where she had gone afterward. In the dream, for the first time since she died, he had seen her not as a woman who had been taken from him, but as a woman who was, right now, impossibly, joyfully, more alive and more herself than she had ever been on earth, in a field greener than anything real, laughing the laugh he used to hear from the parking lot. He said, "I don't understand why he let it happen, Claire. I still don't. But I finally let myself believe, for the first time in 3 years, that wherever she actually is right now, it is better than anywhere she has ever been, and that he loves her more than I ever managed to, even on my best days as her son. And I think I have to let that be enough for now, because I don't think I'm ever going to get the other answer, not in this life, and I have spent 3 years refusing to move an inch until I did." We sat up together until almost 4 that morning, and I did not say a single word about church, or about faith, or about the last 3 years, not one word, because I understood, even half asleep, that this was not a moment that needed my help. I simply held his hand and let him talk until he ran out of things to say, and then we both slept, for the first time in longer than I could remember, without either of us carrying something unspoken into the dark with us. He went to church the following Sunday on his own, before I had even suggested it, and sat in the same pew his father had sat in alone for 3 years. And Frank, I am told, did not say a word, just reached over at some point during the second song and put his hand on his son's shoulder, and left it there. I was not with him that first Sunday, having stayed home with Grace, who had come down with a fever the night before, and I have since heard the details of that morning from several different people, each of whom noticed something slightly different. Pam, from the women's ministry, told me she nearly dropped the bulletins she was handing out at the door when she saw him walk in, and had to compose herself before greeting the next family in line. Ruth Talbot, who was 83 that year and still came every week without fail, told me she sat 2 rows behind him and spent the entire service praying instead of singing, tears running the whole time, because she said she had been praying for that exact sight for 3 years and had genuinely begun to wonder, in her more honest moments, whether she would live long enough to see it. Walter Combs himself was there too, sitting near the back as he always did, and he told me later that watching Ryan walk in that morning was the first time in 3 years he had let himself fully feel the weight of what his own words beside that hospital bed might have cost, though it would still be several more weeks before Ryan sought him out to say so directly. It took another few weeks before Ryan went forward during an invitation, the Sunday I told you about at the very start of this story, and stood at that altar rail, with his shoulders shaking, praying out loud, for the first time in 3 years, in front of nearly 200 people who had watched this whole thing unfold from a distance, without ever quite knowing the full shape of it. Pastor Mark met him at the rail and knelt down beside him, and I found out afterward that the first thing Ryan said to him, through tears, was, "Mark, I'm sorry it took so long," and Mark told him there was nothing to apologize for, that some questions take exactly as long as they take, and that the Lord had clearly not been in any hurry to give up on him either. I want to tell you what happened in the weeks after that, because the story does not end with Ryan. It ends, in its own smaller way, with everyone who spent 3 years telling me to walk away. Danielle came to see me first, about a month later, sitting across from me in the same booth at the Cracker Barrel where she had once said the word divorce out loud, and she told me, plainly, that she had been wrong. Not wrong to worry, she said, but wrong to believe that worry gave her the right to tell me what my own faithfulness was worth. She said watching Ryan pray at that altar rail had undone something in her she had not expected, because for 3 years she had quietly assumed I was simply too afraid, or too stubborn, to see what everyone else could see, and she said she owed me an apology for underestimating both my judgment and my God in the very same breath. She said, "I am sorry, Claire. I should have asked you what you believed instead of telling you what I believed for you." I told her there was nothing to forgive that I had not already set down long before she said any of it, which was mostly true, though I appreciated the words anyway, because some debts are worth paying even after the one holding them has already stopped counting. The woman from the women's ministry, whose name is Pam, caught me in the church parking lot a few weeks after that, and I could tell by the way she approached, slower than usual, hands wrapped around her purse strap, that she had been building up to the conversation for a while. She told me she had thought of that conversation, the one about releasing him, more times than she wanted to admit, and that watching Ryan return had made her wonder whether she had confused her own theology of letting go with something closer to giving up, and that she was not sure, even now, exactly where the line between those two things sat, but that she no longer believed I had been the one standing on the wrong side of it. She did not use the word sorry directly, which I noticed, and I have decided that is simply the shape her apology was always going to take, careful and a little sideways, and I have chosen to receive it as fully as if she had said the word outright, because I believe that is what she meant underneath it. My own mother apologized differently, more quietly, on a Sunday afternoon a few weeks later, sitting at that same kitchen table where she had once told me she did not think I should have to spend 40 years married to a stranger. She told me she had watched me those 3 years the way you watch someone walk toward a cliff edge, certain I was about to fall, and that she had never once considered the possibility that she simply could not see the ground on the other side that I was walking toward. She said, "I was scared for you, honey, and being scared made me certain, and those are not the same thing, and I am sorry I let my fear talk louder than my faith in you." Walter Combs, the deacon whose words in that hospital room had planted the wound in the first place, without him ever knowing it, found out the whole story only after Ryan came back, when Ryan himself sought him out one Sunday after service and told him, gently, exactly what that sentence beside his mother's bed had done inside him for 3 years. Walter wept, right there in the fellowship hall, an old man in his 70s, undone by a sentence he had meant only for comfort, and told Ryan he was more sorry than he knew how to say, that he had spent 50 years trying to bring people closer to God in hospital rooms, and had never once considered that the same true thing, said at the wrong moment, could do exactly the opposite. Ryan told him what he had told me, that the sentence itself had not actually been wrong, only early, arriving in a heart that was not yet able to hold it, and that he did not blame Walter for a single word of it anymore. I asked Ryan once, not long ago, whether he still thought about that verse in Exodus, the one Walter had spoken beside his mother's bed, and whether it still troubled him the way it once had. He said it still crosses his mind sometimes, usually late at night, but that it no longer feels like a locked door the way it did for 3 years. He said he has come to believe that a God large enough to decide who sees and who does not, who hears and who does not, is also, somehow, the same God who let him see his own mother laughing in a field greener than anything real, and that he has decided he would rather live inside that second mystery than keep standing outside the first one, waiting for an explanation he no longer believes is coming in this life. My sister Emily called me the week after that, having heard the news from our mother, and I could hear in her voice before she even finished her first sentence that she already knew what she wanted to say. She reminded me, gently, of that text message about closed doors and better things God had waiting, and told me she had thought about it more than once over the following 2 years, wondering whether she had simply been wrong, or worse, whether she had mistaken her own discomfort with watching me struggle for some kind of prophetic insight into what God was actually doing. She said, "I am sorry, Claire. I think I wanted you to have an easier answer more than I actually believed the hard one wasn't true, and I should have just told you I loved you and left the theology out of it entirely." I told her I forgave her before she had even finished apologizing, because I understood exactly the impulse she was describing, the desire to hand someone you love a tidier story than the one they are actually living. Here is where everyone stands now, since I know you will want to know. Ryan reads from that same worn Bible Joyce gave him every morning now, at the same kitchen table where he once refused to pray before meals, and prays over Grace at bedtime the same way his mother once prayed over him in his own doorway, hallway light behind him instead of her. Frank still sits beside him in that pew every single Sunday, and neither one of them has ever needed to say out loud what that means to either of them. Grace is 4 now, and she has already picked up her father's habit of asking, most nights before bed, to hear about Grandma Joyce, a woman she never met and yet somehow already loves the way you love a character from your favorite story. And Ryan tells her a little more of the truth each year as she grows old enough to hold it, including, now, the part about the dream, which she has taken to calling the field, as in, "Tell me about the field again, Daddy," and he tells it to her exactly the way he told it to me that first night, word for word, down to the reading glasses Joyce was not wearing. I made Joyce's pot roast the Sunday after Ryan's first Sunday back at the altar rail, from the recipe she had corrected in my own handwriting on one of our last Thursday afternoons together, and I set the table the way she used to, and Frank came and cried a little over the first bite, and told me it tasted exactly right, which I have decided is one of the finest compliments anyone has ever paid me. Ryan said the blessing over that meal himself, out loud, the first time he had done so in over 3 years, and thanked God specifically, by name, for his mother, and for the family sitting around that table, and I do not think I will ever eat that particular meal again, without remembering exactly how it felt to hear him say her name in a prayer, for the first time since she had died. Danielle and I are closer now than we were before any of this happened, strange as that sounds, because an apology honestly given tends to build something sturdier than the friendship it repairs. My mother asks me now, gently, real questions about how Ryan is doing, rather than offering opinions about what I ought to do about him, and I have come to understand that is its own quiet kind of apology, repeated in a new shape every time she asks. Emily and I talk most weeks now too, and she has stopped, I have noticed, offering theology about anyone else's hard circumstances, mine or otherwise, which I think is its own small fruit of everything she walked through with me at a distance. Ruth Talbot passed away peacefully this past winter, at 86, and Ryan and I were both at her funeral, sitting near the front, and I made a point of telling her family, before I left that day, exactly what she had said to me in my car that night years before, because I did not want that particular piece of wisdom to disappear along with her. Her daughter told me it did not surprise her in the least, that her mother had spent most of her long widowhood quietly talking younger women out of cliff edges they could not yet see the other side of, and that she had likely never once mentioned it to a soul beyond the woman standing in front of her at the time, because she did not consider it the kind of thing worth taking credit for. I still think about Ruth Talbot's question more than almost anything else from those 3 years. Not whether staying guaranteed anything, only whether I still believed God was able to do something I could not yet see. I did not always believe that steadily, or gracefully, across 3 whole years. Some weeks I believed it only barely, only just enough to make the same small decision one more time. But it turned out to be enough, in the end, and I do not think it needed to be any more than that the whole way through. I want to say plainly, because I think it matters, that I do not believe my own faith made this happen, the way you might believe a particular amount of prayer purchases a particular outcome. I do not think Ryan came back because I prayed hard enough, or was patient enough, or was somehow more righteous than the friends who told me to leave. I think Ryan came back because God is patient in ways that have very little to do with how well any of the rest of us manage to wait alongside him. What my faithfulness did, I have come to believe, was simply keep a door open on my side of things, so that when he was finally ready to walk back through it, there was still a home standing on the other side of it for him to walk back into. I do not think I get credit for the miracle itself. I only get credit, if any credit is due at all, for not locking the door while I waited to see whether one was coming. If you are somewhere in the middle of your own 3 years right now, praying for someone who has gone quiet on God, with people around you who love you telling you plainly that you are wasting your life on a closed door, I cannot promise you a dream is coming, or that it will take 3 years and not 10, or that it will come at all in this life. I do not have that kind of certainty to hand you, and I would rather tell you the truth than something comforting and false. What I can tell you is that the years were not wasted, not one of them, even the ones that felt the most like standing still, because faithfulness was never actually about the outcome. It was about staying who you already were, one more week at a time, for as long as it took. I think often about how differently this story might read if I were telling it to you from the middle of it, rather than from this side, and I want to be honest that I do not know what I would have said to myself back then if some future version of me had shown up with the ending already written. I do not think certainty was ever actually available to me, and I am not sure it is available to you either, whatever season of waiting you are currently living inside. What was available, the whole time, every single day of those 3 years, was simply the next decision, the next dinner made, the next quiet prayer said, over a sleeping husband who did not know I was praying it, the next Sunday morning spent alone in a pew that used to hold 2 people. I have come to believe that faith, in seasons like this one, is rarely one large decision made bravely at the very beginning. It is 1,000 small ones, made quietly, on ordinary Tuesdays, by people nobody else is watching closely enough to call brave. That is my story. 3 years, 1 sentence beside a hospital bed, 1 field greener than anything real, and a husband who came all the way back not because I argued him there, but because I simply never stopped believing there was somewhere left for him to come back to. Frank told me, at that same pot roast dinner, that he believed Joyce had known something the whole time none of the rest of us could have known yet, back when she told me in the receiving line that she had prayed for me for over a decade before I ever met her son. He said maybe she had simply kept praying, wherever she went, and that some of those prayers had taken 3 more years to land than the rest, but had landed all the same. I do not know if that is exactly how it works, and I am not sure anyone alive actually does. But I have decided it is a comforting enough thought to hold on to, on the nights I still miss her, which are still fairly often, even now. I think about Joyce most on ordinary days now, more than on the anniversaries, which surprised me the first time I noticed it. A particular slant of afternoon light through our kitchen window, the smell of a pot roast 3 streets over on someone else's stove, Grace laughing a laugh that is, unmistakably, her father's mother's laugh, passed down through a woman she will never meet in this life. I have stopped waiting for the grief to finish, the way I once waited for Ryan's anger to finish, and have started, instead, simply living alongside it, the same patient, unglamorous way I once learned to live alongside 3 years of his silence, one ordinary day at a time. If you have ever prayed for someone for longer than felt reasonable, with no evidence it was working, I want to hear about it. Tell me in the comments because I believe there are far more of us carrying that particular kind of quiet, thankless faithfulness than anybody around us ever realizes. And if this one meant something to you, share it with somebody who needs to hear that their years of praying are not wasted. And if you have not subscribed yet, I would love to have you here for the next one.